Hey y'all. I know it's been a while since I put out another video, but I really was struggling to think about what it was that inspired a lot of the different elements of my story. And today I've brought a few examples that can really show you where my mindset is on how I develop certain parts of the story. And we're going to start with something I've talked about before, J.R.R. Tolkien's The Hobbit. Now, I've already said that my main character, Jinx the Goblin, is a lot like Bilbo Baggins. He's a small character who lives basically in the middle of nowhere, and he gets kind of roped into this adventure with this one sort of misfit group. In the Hobbit, he gets kind of included into the band of dwarves. In my book, he gets kind of shanghaied into helping out the dreadnoughts, who are vilified as like as the bad guys of the city. There are a lot of similarities to The Hobbit as well as to my book, at least in its structure and how it flows. You've got the characters running all over the place, going to different parts of the world. My city, the city of Purgatory, has at its base, or it has at its center, a gigantic mountain, which is a lot like the mountain of the Hobbit, the Lonely Mountain. There is also going to be a battle between several different groups towards the end of the story, much like the Battle of the Five Armies, so named for by like the movie that they made, where you've got the dreadnoughts and the council and this outside group attacking the city in my book. And in The Hobbit, you've got the goblins from the mountains, you got the dwarves, you got the people of Lake Town, you've got the beasts that Beorn calls upon, and you have the elves from the woods that the dwarves kind of like piss off. They all culminate and attack the mountain. Before that happens, the dragon Smaug attacks the city of Lake Town. So you got this big monster fight, which actually leads me to the next inspiration for my story, right here. Shin Gojira, or Godzilla God. Now, Godzilla as a character is really interesting, and it's really interesting as a story, because Godzilla is supposed to personify a natural disaster. And nothing in the Godzilla canon works better than this movie, this 2016 remake of Godzilla, where they basically tell the story over from the beginning. In this movie, Godzilla arrives as a brand new monster. No one's ever heard of him before, no one's ever seen him before. He's basically a tadpole-like creature at first, until he grows into a much bigger creature and eventually becomes the gigantic Godzilla that we all know and love. This movie is incredibly inspirational because it shows a lot of the sort of like politics of dealing with a natural disaster from the Japanese perspective, of course. Godzilla is the main antagonist, for certain, but he's not treated like a villain that needs to be killed. He's treated like a a a storm. He's treated like a hurricane. He's treated like this terrible problem of this terrible destructive force of nature that the government has to address. He's a threat to the nation, but they can't just shoot him with tanks. They try that and it doesn't work. So they have to rely on other means. And they also have to rely on things like international support. They have to rely on things like how to evacuate the citizens, how to mitigate the damage. This was incredibly useful for when I wrote my chapter, Disaster Prevention and Mitigation, where you have an actual giant monster that attacks one of the neighborhoods of my city. And I use this as a means to show how the dreadnoughts and the council both address the same situation. The council are politicians, the council are the city leaders. They are going to do a lot more of the sort of like redirecting of resources. They're going to control traffic, they're going to direct the police to evacuate citizens, and they're going to do what they can to push the monster away from the city, a lot like what happens in this movie. Whereas the dreadnoughts try to address the monster more like an actual monster, kind of like how Smaug was slain in The Hobbit. And because they're mostly sort of brute force type characters, they're going to try and outright kill the monster instead of like push him away from the city. So I really did enjoy both perspectives when it comes to the the way that both groups sort of like view the problem and address the problem. Now, the third inspiration for the city itself was Valerian and the City of a Thousand Planets. I know that this movie is based off a graphic novel. I have not read the graphic novel. Sue me. But I do like how this movie portrays a world that is very diverse, that has different cultures, that has different groups that live together in the same sort of like in the same space. In this movie, if you haven't seen it, the City of a Thousand Planets is basically a giant space station where alien races from other worlds just add on their own vessels and they add on their own infrastructure to the station until it becomes this giant convoluted ball of technology and minerals because they add like actual pieces of Earth and planet onto it. And I really love that idea of having this incredibly colorful world that makes sense. It's not just random things thrown together. There's a reason why all of these beings are together, which goes with my theme of mixing different story elements, like what I explained in a much earlier video. You've got the horror neighborhood, you've got the fantasy neighborhood, you've got the western neighborhood, you've got the you've got like the oceanic neighborhood, and they're all in the same sphere, and it makes a lot of sense. The fourth inspiration I have involves the actual creatures themselves, the actual races of my world. It's very high fantasy in that you've got like elves and dwarves and halflings and fairies. But what I really focused on was one book, Brian Jacques' Redwall novels. This is a great example because in this book, you don't have elves or fairies, you have woodland creatures. But each woodland creature is treated like their own race. They have their own sort of personality arcs and they have their own cultural arcs. For example, the badgers of this world are very noble and they're very strong and they're knights in shining armor and they fight for truth and justice and so on. You have rabbits who are very jokey, very playful. They're usually like jester type characters. They don't take things too seriously. They're often slackers, but they're good at heart. You know, they're just very jovial. You have the moles who are masons. You have the otters who are usually sailors. And the villains of the story are also particular races as well. You've got weasels, foxes. I don't believe there are snakes, but there are definitely rats. So I liked that when you looked at a specific type of animal, when you looked at a specific race or species in the story, you can tell what their cultural background is, and you can tell their personality arc. And I really did enjoy that idea when it came to my story, where you've got the demons who are usually very abrasive and they're very rough, and the angels who are very arrogant because they live high up in golden towers and they look down upon everybody. And you've got the undead who are just kind of gross and they're falling apart and they're rotting. So they're unpleasant, but they're not necessarily evil. So that was a huge inspiration when it came to like character development. And the last example I have for you, in regards to some of the inspirations I could think of, was a scene from one book that inspired a chapter for my book. The book in question, Jordan R. Dickson's The Dragon, the Earl, and the Troll. Quick context. The story takes place in the Earl's castle. The dragon is actually a wizard who is invited to the Earl's castle for a feast. The story starts off pretty well. There's food, there's entertainment, there's music, everyone's having a good time until the castle starts to shake and there are cracks in the walls and in the foundation. And this threatens, obviously, the infrastructure of the castle, but it threatens the Earl's party. So, upon investigation, they discover that there is actually a troll who is under the castle, shaking the castle violently because of some grievance that he has with the Earl. Now, the scene that I'm pointing out that inspired my book, or that inspired a chapter of my book, is exactly what you see depicted here on the cover. This is a chapter in this book where the dragon, the Earl, and the troll sit down and have a conversation. Now, the two feuding factions are the Earl himself and the troll himself. Those are the two who are butting heads. And the dragon sort of sits in as the moderator. He's the one there to keep the peace, to help make sure both sides have their say, while the two feuding members of the conversation kind of go at it. This was really helpful when it came to a chapter in my book, which takes place just after the big monster attack, where the council and the dreadnoughts butt heads. Because remember, they both kind of try to address the big monster attack in their own way. And you can imagine that they're going to get in each other's way, where the council is trying to solve the situation in one method, and the dreadnoughts are trying to solve the situation in a different method. Well, after it gets resolved, the two kind of clash, and they start arguing over who was doing what right, who was doing what wrong. That's the dragon and the troll, or excuse me, that was the Earl and the troll fighting each other. Jinx, I see as the dragon, as the sort of neutral third party who is getting between the two and trying to be the voice of reason, trying to moderate. He's not really going to succeed, I don't imagine, because he's the little guy in the story who nobody really pays attention to, but he has been present for the interaction between these characters time and again. So you would think that he would have some say. I say you would think because I have not actually written this chapter, but I do imagine the clash being something along the lines of what I just discussed. You've got the dreadnoughts lined up, you've got the council lined up in front of them. They're just arguing and bitching and moaning, and Jinx is trying to stand between them, trying to argue both points. Like, well, they did this right, they did this right, you guys made this mistake, you guys are in the wrong, trying to show some devil's advocacy, as it were, for both sides, because he is the neutral third party. Anyways, that's all I could really think of for the inspirations of my books. Obviously, there are all sorts of other inspirations. I mentioned earlier that I pulled heavily from the actual world I live in for inspiring a lot of what I was writing. I'm sure there are a lot of other subtle inspirations and sort of ideas that I pulled from other sources that I can't really think of at the moment. Partly because it took me a while to think about these inspirations, and also because I don't have props for them. But whenever I think of something new to discuss with the book, I'll definitely share that with you all.